Hi, and welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to talk about key insight 2, sustainability and decarbonization. Well, if you look at the total global water, 96.5% is stored in the oceans, and only 2.5% is considered freshwater, and 0.9% is other saline water. And out of that global freshwater, 68.7% is stored in glaciers and ice caps, only 30.1% is in groundwater, and 1.2% is there as surface and other fresh water. Then if you look at and further expand surface water and other fresh water, ground ice and permafrost is about 69%, lakes are about 20.9%, soil moisture is about 3.8%, swamps and marshes it's around 2.6%, rivers are about 0.49%, 3% is basically the atmosphere, and 0.26 is considered to be in living things. So sustainable water management is basically it should be able to provide adequate quantity of water in the appropriate water quality for a given need without compromising the future ability to provide this capacity and quality. So it's all about ensuring we have adequate quality water and capacity for future needs. So we know that the oceans have a lot of water, but it's not suitable for human drinking because of high levels of salt in it. So due to these challenges, a lot of companies and startups are planning on large-scale seawater desalinization. So seawater desalinization is basically the process of removing minerals and salts from seawater, and it's also used by many ships and submarines for their own drinking water purposes. So it has a very high energy consumption, and it's also more costly than obtaining fresh water from surface water or groundwater, water recycling and water conservation. So it's very expensive to do seawater desalinization on a commercial level. But also the process leaves behind a byproduct called brine. So brine is a high concentration solution of salt in the water, and also it's used for things like food processing, cooking, de-icing of the roads and other structures, and a number of other technological processes. But also, brine has other pollutants as well, so getting rid of brine is also a significant environmental challenge. So desalinization is usually done using two methods. The first is thermal, so you basically heat up the salt water until you get the pure water vapors, and then you cool it down to get the water. So other one is the mechanical, or what we call the membrane. So for example, reverse osmosis. And if you look at the method reverse osmosis, it's used around 70% of the water desalinization plants all around the world. And this method is much more cheaper and much more efficient than the thermal method. So if you look at sustainability, there are lots of trends that's coming up. The first is the rising stakeholder demands from both investors, general public, government regulators, and other kind of international bodies as well. So the changes in the attitude and perceptions of people are putting pressure on businesses to change course for a low carbon future. And businesses are also coming to realize the pressure and beginning to realize the need for a much more greener and sustainable planet, but also to ensure customer loyalty and long-term viability of their investments as well, and concerns of making their ESG, or what we call environmental, social and governance frameworks. So ESG, or environmental, social and governance frameworks, focuses on three factors, which is environmental factors and other kind of related environmental frameworks. Then there's social component. Social component focuses on the society's well-being. Then there's governance frameworks to ensure that you have strong governance frameworks, compliance frameworks to ensure equitable access to water, and also so many other factors including financials, taking care of the community and so forth. So companies are also planning of making their ESG commitments transparent and following through those commitments, and there are also things like sustainable energy usage as well. Then we have things like policy and government targets. So a lot of governments all around the world are making public declarations of when their country will go carbon negative or carbon zero, and also they would set mandatory carbon reduction commitments and targets, accelerated transition towards a greener economy, carbon pricing schemes. For example, a lot of governments all around the world are introducing something called a carbon tax, so a tax based on the carbon emissions that you generate, and also adopting a price on carbon either through direct taxation on fossil fuels or through cap and trade programs. So cap and trade is basically you set levels and then you can offset your carbon emissions with another green company. So there's also things like investor pressures. So response to policy shifts and demands from stakeholders, investors are also changing their investment strategies. So for example, if you look at the massive asset manager, which is BlackRock, which is the world's largest fund manager, they manage about $9.8 trillion worth of assets under management. So they are strictly enforcing these ESG or environmental, social and governance frameworks to assess their investment portfolio, and also they're selling investments which advance fossil fuel consumption, and they are also pledging to vote against management teams that do not disclose their sustainability KPIs or key performance indicators. Then there's also technology cost reductions. So there's exponential technological innovation. So for example, things like smart water meters and all these things which are able to accurately understand the water consumption in real time and relay that vital piece of data back to the water utility provider. So similar to these, a lot of innovative technologies are being developed. So for example, discovering new saltwater filtration method and membranes that are advancing the acceleration towards a greener economy. And also there are exponential advancements in communication technologies, for example like 5G, and there's also going to be global low Earth orbit or LEO satellite internet coverage, which will entirely cover the globe, and everyone on planet Earth will be able to get high speed, high bandwidth internet access despite whether they are being in remote locations. And also there are things like blockchain technology, which I'm going to talk about in one of our next lectures. So that's making things much more harder for people to tamper data. And there's also digital twins like we talked about previously. Then there's artificial intelligence enabled business processes which focus on continuous improvement and also reducing wastage, increasing productivity as well as efficiency. Then there are also other innovative technologies like carbon capture and storage. So this is a combination of technologies designed to prevent the release of carbon dioxide, which is generated through industrial processes. For example, water treatment plants and water management plants can combine these kind of technologies to capture the carbon dioxide and other pollutants and to store them in a safe manner. So these technologies prevent the release of carbon dioxide, which is generated through industrial processes and conventional fossil fuel based power generation, by injecting carbon dioxide to suitable underground locations like abandoned oil and gas fields, deep saline formations, and extractable coal seams. So talking a bit more about ESGs or environmental and social governance frameworks, it's something like this. So there's this environmental component that focuses on things like climate change and sustainability strategy, biodiversity, natural resources, pollution, and waste management. Then there's a social aspect of it, which is basically focusing on universal human rights, human capital development, occupational safety, and addressing things like child labor. Then there's a governance framework, which is basically focusing on diversity of the board, business ethics, corporate governance frameworks, corruption, fraud, and instability. So there are lots of challenges when it comes to moving to a much more sustainable future. The main thing is aligning with the customers and stakeholders. So consumers are also starting to value the importance to support the companies that align with their own values and principles and ethical commitments, including things like commitment to information confidentiality, data privacy, environmental protection, animal rights, giving back to the local community, equality and inclusivity. Then there's also building and maintaining a strong brand image. So a strong ESG framework in your business would enhance your brand image and also reduce any risk associated with ESG factors, positively impact the revenue and company valuation, and also improve the overall market perception. But there are common misconceptions and problematic practices of companies regarding ESGs. So main thing is the excessive focus on ESG ratings. So ticking boxes in ESG frameworks to improve the company's rating and credibility and brand image and reputation, rather than developing a strategy that is customized to the company's unique value proposition, or basically what the company stands for and what the company's purpose is, and exposure to risk. Then treating ESG ratings as a communication effort. So actions are not reflecting the messaging and the communication. Then there are things like inconsistencies across firms, so lack of a company-wide strategy and coordination. And finally, the lack of assessment and monitoring. So lack of measuring and monitoring metrics of the ESG frameworks, inability to assess and determine whether the company's actions align with its intended ESG targets. Also, we know that we can't measure what we don't quantify. So figuring out the right metrics and measurements to measure these ESG framework implementations is also important. Well, that's about it for Key Insight 2, Sustainability and Decarbonization. I'll see you on another lecture.